Hello and welcome to all the men and women of the West. To start with, everyone knows John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. He's a man who needs no introduction where mythic or fantasy fiction is concerned. He's honestly the greatest author in the genre who ever lived, and frankly, one of the most charming and inspiring individuals of the 20th century. His spirited defense of fairy stories is one that is really quite remarkable. The first page, though, is quite dry, with Tolkien setting the stage for an introduction to the linguistic history of the term fairy, or rather, fairy. It is a nice intro, with Tolkien even throwing in a bit of poetry before getting to the serious business of expanding the psychology and ideas behind a genre he's helped transform into the finest in existence. The bit that caught my eye, not very far into the essay, about page 5 of the version I have, introduces Tolkien's thoughts on magic, and it is fascinating to say the least. Faerie itself may perhaps most nearly be translated by magic, but it is a magic of a peculiar mood and power, at the furthest pole from the vulgar devices of the laborious scientific magician. The aforementioned quote shows Tolkien's positive revulsion towards the scientific, towards magicians, and towards the advancement of technology. Everyone knows this, and how industrialization was something he was disgusted with, and felt to be a blight upon nature. In The Lord of the Rings, we see three lands bent on industrialization: Mordor, Isengard, and the Shire. Mordor is, of course, the Black Land. Isengard damages the landscape and wrecks all around the great tower of Saruman, while the Shire is ruined by Saruman, who introduces what can only be termed an industrial revolution to the hobbits. Tolkien is here dividing the fairy from the science fiction, from the modern, from all other genres. He is establishing the idea here that what we have is a genre focused around magic, one which stands at the opposite totem pole, so to speak, from the advancement of science. There is one province. If there is any satire present in the tale, one thing must not be made fun of: the magic itself. That must in the story be taken seriously, neither laughed at nor explained away. Of this seriousness, the medieval Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is an admirable example. The proviso here is one that establishes that magic must never be the butt of the joke. In fact, it must never be part of the joke. The reason for this is that it lies at the heart of the story, and that to do so would be tear apart one's own story. The reason this rings so true, especially in the past few decades, is that magic has indeed become the butt of the joke, and fairy stories, fantasy and mythic, have been subverted. What Tolkien is really advocating against this deconstruction, subversion of magic. I'll explain my reasoning. Subversion as a process to undermine and demoralize a people was already a thing back then. Goes back centuries. And Tolkien knew the effect of making something beautiful ridiculous. What he was pleading for here was to not subvert, not deconstruct the sacred in fairy stories, because once you make fun of it, turn magic into a source of ridicule, the magic will be lost. He knew this, and this is why he says what he says. Because think about it. How could you take a tale seriously, believe in the risks and desperation of the hero's story, if you laugh at what lies at the heart of the tale, and the world that's been built up? To laugh at it is to deconstruct the story itself. It is to make the most serious and terrible and wondrous elements to the tale something to be ridiculed. And make no mistake, wonder is on trial in movies and TV shows such as those that have come out recently, as wonder was what the genre was built upon. Just look not only at Tolkien, but his semi-rival Robert E. Howard, with his many myriad tales, An Hour of the Dragon, or any of the authors who succeeded them, or filmmakers such as Miyazaki. What is the one thing they all aim to do? Fill their worlds with wonder. And think of the movies of the past 15 years. Have any of them struck as much of a chord with you as those of old? The wonder has gone out. In order to understand it, as pointed out by Gandalf in Lord of the Rings, some have had to break the thing, and that's not led to any great wisdom. What it has led to, it is to a lesser grasp of what makes magic so magical. As to the tale of Gawain and the Green Knight, it is one of the most magical, mystical, and beautiful tales of all times. It is an epic story of Gawain's quest, and has reimagined a staple in the Occidental Hemisphere for a long time for a reason. In it, the magic and wonder of the world in which Gawain inhabits is preserved and respected. In it, humor isn't used to punch down at the genre. And this is important, as humor in recent years has been directed this way rather than punching upwards. And that brings us to another matter. You should have some humor in a story, by all means. Even Tolkien had it. But one thing that he never mocks or sneers at is magic. And so it should remain, because once you go down that route, there is no hope to recapture the magic of the story. It's gone. It is gone like smoke that's left a building after you open the window. It has escaped and cannot be recaptured. Is this to say that all recent fantasy stories are bad? Not at all. There's been a great many that have been wondrous, have been magnificent, and deserve much merit. Look at the movie Tangled. I would argue that it is a supreme example of a recent work that takes the magic at the heart of the tale seriously. There are gags, to be sure, but the actual magic is to say the youth-giving hair of Rapunzel is never truly mocked. It is braided. The after effects are jested about, but the hair itself is shown to be a beautiful and amazingly mystical thing. There is also the recent 2015 video game remake of King's Quest, which had about 5 or 6 chapters or parts to it. In there, magic is never jested about, but rather held up on a pedestal, but also treated as very dangerous and serious business. It is dangerous because one wrong move with it could lead to one's destruction. Starting from part 2 and moving forward into the latter parts of the tale, magic becomes rapidly more distressing and disturbing elements of the plot. We see it tear father and son apart, see it shatter and tear asunder men's very beings, and more. In this regard, while the story like that of Tangled has its butt monkeys and its figures of ridicule, in moments of ridicule, it never dares to mock the magic. You might think this is taking things too seriously. Maybe. But one should but one should take one's genre seriously when writing it. You should take the romance in, let's say, Musashi or Gone with the Wind seriously. You should take the science of Star Wars, Star Trek, and others, just as you should take the horror within horror seriously. Same goes for magic. Take it seriously, tackle the wonder at the heart of the genre with a great deal of thought, and you'll create something magnificent. This is not to say, be utterly humorless. Just be careful with what you mock. You want your story to last, so you have to tackle the wonder and mystique of magic with the utmost respect. Because only you can make it real. But that, I mean, only you can make it real in the sense bringing it to life within the imagination of your readers. But even if we apply only these vague and ill-defined limits, it becomes plain that many, even the learned, in such matters have used the term fairy tale very carelessly. A glance at these books of recent times that claim to be collections of fairy stories is enough to show that tales about fairies, about the fair family in any of its houses, or even about dwarves and goblins, are only a small part of their content. Here what Tolkien is doing is establishing that a great many use the term fairy tale very loosely to describe the genre. He is tackling how a great many authors might pigeonhole their stories into a genre and say, ta-da, it is a fairy story or fantasy. And this is genuinely a problem. Because if everything is fantasy, then nothing is. This might just be a meme, but it applies here. Once everything from sci-fi to horror to romance become fantasy, there is no fantasy. The genre survives on tales about fairies, about the fair family, in any of its houses, or even about dwarves or goblins, are only a small part of their content. This lies at the heart of the story. Sure, you could combine elements of this or that to the tale. I'm not the rule maker, do what you want, but at what point does constantly adding stuff start to remove from it? You can and should be allowed to depict, let's say, giant robots managed by mutants, but if there's no world building, no fairy tale elements, and no magic, is it even fantasy anymore? Probably not. I know it isn't popular to say, but it must be said. Fairy stories are a different genre from the others. Each one is unique and offers a different experience, and they should. They all have something that gives them wonder, and that inspire awe and admiration in their readers. But the fairy element is very particular to this genre, which has goblins and dwarves and strange fair families, as Tolkien points out. It is one of the strange peculiarities of the genre, is at his point that it relies upon, and is in many ways not detached from the early fairy tales of Brothers Grimm, Perrault, and so many others who collected them and passed them down in anthological fashion. But these books also contain many tales that do not even touch upon fairy at all. They have in fact no business to be included. Tolkien is stating that there's a great many stories ought not to be included when saying what is fairy tale and what isn't. Too many stories have been lumped in that have no business being lumped in with the rest. I will give one or two examples of the expurgations I would perform. This will assist the negative side of definition. It will also be found to lead on to the second question. What are the origins of fairy stories? The number of collections of fairy stories is now very great. In English, None probably rival either the popularity or the inclusiveness or the general merits of the 12 books of 12 colors which we owe to Andrew Lang and his wife. The first of those appeared more than 70 years ago in 1889 and is still in print. Most of its content passed the test, more or less clearly. I'll not analyze them, though an analysis might be interesting. But I note in passing that of the stories in this Blue Fairy book, none are primarily about fairies. Few refer to them. Most of the tales are taken from French sources. A just choice in some ways at that time, as perhaps it would be still, though not to my taste, now or in childhood. At any rate, so powerful has been the influence of Charles Perrault since his Contes de ma Mère de Loi were first Englished in the 18th century, and of such excerpts from the vast storehouses of the Cabinet de Fées as have become well known, that still, I suppose, if you asked a man to name a typical fairy story, he would be most likely to name one of these French things, such as Puss in Boots, Cinderella, or Little Red Riding Hood. With some people, Grimm's fairy tales might come first to mind. Here, Tolkien lays down the whole of the history of fairy stories, from the earliest beginning of collecting them into large anthologies, to the more recent ones. He then goes on to comment at some length about pygmies, and then into the development of one theory regarding the elf, wherein they were believed to have sprung from Cain. Tolkien's evidently not sure about this one, and is an interesting notion. He comments that the greatest thing about fairy stories is the distance. This is where the real magic can be found. It is the distance from them as they tend to grow in magnificence and wonder with the retelling. The magic of fairy is not an end in itself. Its virtue is in its operations. Among these are the satisfaction of certain primordial human desires. One of these desires is to survey the depth of space and time. Another is, as will be seen, to hold communion with other living things. A story may thus deal with the satisfaction of these desires, with or without the operation of either machine or magic, and in proportion as it succeeds, it will approach the quality and have the flavor of fairy stories. Here we get a real interesting exploration of what the genre and magic means to him. First off, he acknowledges that they are primordial tales. They ought to be archetypal, magical, and mystical in ways many today could not possibly fathom. The next major point is the idea of surveying the depths of space and time, which is to say, to build a world all on its own, one that is apart from this one. For the readers, it means to escape from this one, into one of magic and wonder, while for the writer, it is an intellectual exercise that involves subcreation of an entire pantheon of existence that must awe the reader. What is more is that if one does not create a secondary world, what one is doing is interacting with space and time in our own world and tweaking it, which is itself a fascinating thought exercise and one that is quite remarkable. As to interacting with living things or holding communion with them, this means to speak to the soul. It might also to be in communion with the soul of the readers, as reading, as we all know, is a very spiritual thing. In this way, what Tolkien speaks to doing here is holding communion with them and being respectful of them. He is also talking about how one is interacting with very old energies when writing or reading fantasy. Like it or not, there are ancient spiritual forces in this world, and the Faerie genre is one that is somehow connected to them. It is a strange connection, and one that Tolkien likely believed ought to be treated with respect, and that to commune with irreverently was unwise. A story made us deal with the satisfaction of these desires, with or without the operation of either machine or magic, and its proportion as it succeeds, it will approach the quality and have the flavor of fairy stories. I only reiterate this quote to bring it up fresh in everyone's minds. It is one that is frankly quite intriguing. It expresses that it is possible to interact with the ancient forces of the world. It is possible to write stories with the flavor of fairy story, which is to say that captures the tone, element, and idea of fairy stories without the fantasy genre. This is perfectly true, as there is a magic and wonder, and such to say Star Wars, How I Met Your Mother, and many others. For Star Wars, let us examine how mystical and magical the Force is, and how there are fairy elements to it, as it is a very enchanted universe. This much cannot be denied. It's one of the best parts of the universe, so that it tapped similar sources as the fairy stories for its universe. How I Met Your Mother is another case where there is a fairy element. What I like about that universe is so much is how enchanted it is. It might be modern, but there's something at work within the story. There is a sense of destiny and the idea of once upon a time with Ted Mosby, as he goes through many hardships, developing as a human being and dealing with very peculiar coincidences to arrive before Tracy and sweep her off her feet. What Star Wars in a way did cinematically for science fiction, How I Met Your Mother did for a serialized TV romance series. There is also, in terms of horror, plenty of examples also, as horror in a way is derived from the darker aspects of fairy stories, with the world of the Wolfman from the 1940s, or even those of the Hammer horror movies feeling very much like darker fantasy stories. They are very real and visceral in how they feel, yet there's a brilliance, a splendor, and a glory, and a sense of the once upon a time also. The idea of being warned off from entering the beast's castles feels real in these movies, and happens in a number of them, which only adds to the fairy flavor of these stories. Every genre can and should be able to tap the element of fantasy and fairy stories, but this doesn't necessarily mean that they suddenly magically become fairy stories. Simply because a story is set in medieval England and has similar tropes doesn't make it automatically a fantasy tale, just as a detective story might have a coming-of-age element with a great deal of wonder is not fantasy. This doesn't make them lesser, just different, and it is part of the joy of having so many different genres to choose from. Each one is unique, each one is beautiful. It is quite like staring into a lovely winter wonderland and seeing different kinds of trees, or different trees handle the weight of snow differently from each other. I hope I accurately conveyed my thoughts on this one, and did a good job summarizing this fascinating essay and having fun with it. The next time I tackle this topic, it'll be to tackle the dream element and the element of truth in the genre, that seems to have intrigued Tolkien, as there's some interesting bits there to chew on, hopefully next week.
And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to smash that like and that subscribe button to stay tuned for the next video, and to check out our new crowdfund, which pre-launch page will be in the comments section alongside our Royal Road account. So do check that out.